So Café Europa is a program that we've been running for several years now that brings together BYU faculty from across campus who possess expertise in a particular region or topic related to Europe. The format is meant to be more of a conversation than a presentation, and hence why we position them around a cafe table with their Perrier. And we ask that the audience pretends that you were just eavesdropping, right, on this conversation. But after some time of listening, you will feel compelled to interject, to ask questions, and so on. So we will have our faculty have this conversation for the first 40 minutes or so, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. So let's talk Turkey. Until the last few years, the country has been one of Europe's strongest Middle Eastern allies and a potential member of the EU. The rise of democratically elected President Erdogan and his Islamicist AKP party, however, have challenged Turkey's most favored status. And recent images of Turkey are dominated by brutal repression against demonstrators, political opponents, and representatives of the free press. 10 days ago, the United States suspended visa services in Turkey. Within hours, the country said it would no longer accept visas from U.S. citizens. As the Turks navigate between Western liberalism and authoritarian nationalism, they also must attend to the realities of immigration, the position of its ethnic minorities, and a desire for democratic freedoms. Are these tensions new? And what about Turkey's history can help us understand these contemporary developments and their potential impact on Europe? Let me offer some brief introductions of our discussants. First, Dr. Christine Isom-Verhaaren is an assistant professor in history who has been traveling to Turkey since 1983, when she went to be a camp manager for an archaeological expedition on the Euphrates River. She has spent substantial time in southeastern Turkey, Ankara, and Istanbul. Dr. Isom-Verhaaren's research on the Ottoman Empire has led to long research trips and lately several shorter trips to conduct research in the Ottoman archives and to participate in conferences in Istanbul. She has published both a monograph on Ottoman-French relations in the 16th century titled Allies with the Infidel, as well as an edited volume on Ottoman identity from the 1300s to the end of the empire titled Living in the Ottoman Realm. She was a student of Halil Alkinzik, not even close, please correct me in a moment, the foremost Ottoman historian of his generation who passed away last year at the age of 100. Next is Dr. James Taranto, who is an associate professor of Islamic and Arabic studies and teaches courses in religion, humanities, language, and research methodology. He has lived in Italy for 5 years and in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan for 10 years, teaching in international schools, studying Arabic language and literature, and conducting research. His publications explore issues of Muslim immigration in Europe, Islamic education, legal status of religious minorities, and LDS missiology. For 3 years, he has served as the director of the Center for Cultural and Educational Affairs in Amman, Jordan. Particularly germane to today's discussion is that in July of this year, he returned from living for 2 years in Istanbul, Turkey, where he and his wife supervised humanitarian and volunteer work in the Central Eurasian Mission. And finally, Dr. Rob McFarland, who is a professor of German Studies, Humanities Center Fellow, and author of Red Vienna, White Socialism, and the Blues, among many other publications and projects. One of his primary research interests is how the multicultural cities of Berlin and Vienna, two cities with huge Turkish diaspora populations, is imagined in film, literature, and art, and where he regularly teaches the films of Turkish German filmmakers. Dr. McFarland, who is a member of the European Studies Program's Executive Committee, has graciously agreed to moderate today's discussion. So please join me in welcoming our guests.
European studies in Turkey, what up, right? The tweet go, by the way. We have a Turkish soccer tree go up here, and it's amazing. I remember being in Berlin in 2006 and watching women in hijab that is red, black, and gold, the German colors, wrapped around themselves and cheering for the German team with the Turkish flag as well, held in the same hand, a German flag and a Turkish flag. And this is what we think about a lot of ways. It's supposed to be the model of some successful integration. All the members of the German parliament are of Turkish-German descent and all these things. But I want to discuss a couple of dates, some of them in the past, some of them in the very recent present time, and think about some of the problems that are coming up and how this looks. I'd like to start out with January of 1933, when the Parliament building in Berlin was burned by a Dutch agitator, and how the Nazis quickly grabbed that and put into effect what's called the Ermächtigungsgesetz, the empowerment law, which allowed Hitler to rise to power. Something that is discussed in Germany and is seen as one of the turning points. Every anthology you read in German, anything, ends or begins in 1933, and on that day. Then I want to take us to April 17th, or April of this year, when there was a plebiscite for all Turkish people, including the diaspora in Germany and Europe and other places, other countries in Europe, about expanding Erdogan's powers, and there was all sorts of putting these two things together. This idea of Hitler's grab of power and his eventual takeover and fascism that happened. And then we have this, in April of this year, this idea that Erdogan was doing the same thing. It enjoyed great popularity with the Turkish diaspora in Germany, but not with the Germans, as you can imagine. I'd like to think about one more thing that happened this year and something that happened in the past. Let's go back to 1968, in front of the German opera in Berlin, Charlottenburg. The Shah of Iran pulls up, and he's met with a big group of German demonstrators, and they start throwing flour bags and saying boo and calling on him, and they have little paper bag masks that are on of him. And he's got a security detail with him, and he's got Turkish supporters, he's got Iranian supporters from his Republican Guard, all holding up with the Shah, we love the Shah, and then there's demonstrators. And then the demonstrators, these pro-Shah demonstrators, hear this demonstration, this democratic outpouring against the Shah of Iran. And their signs had unusually large sticks that they were holding them up with. They tear off the signs, turn around, and start wailing on the demonstrators, and are joined by the Berlin police. And what turned into a huge constitutional crisis. The beginning of the 68 student movements, as one of the demonstrators, Benno Ohnesorg, father of two, is killed in this interchange. And they're saying, look, we haven't come anywhere from fascism. We are still fascist. The police still are ready to turn on a dime against the people. There is no democracy here. And there was a big crisis that happened in Germany. And of course, this year again in Washington, Turkish security people turned on American crowds and started beating them again. And in Germany, this was a crisis. It didn't even happen in Germany. But the idea that this seminal moment of German democracy was being repeated in our day, that this all had happened. Again, this plebiscite vastly expanding the almost dictatorial powers of a leader, and then this crisis again of people turning on a democratic, a permitted demonstration. What's going on here? And so, with these things in mind and this backdrop going on, I'd like to turn our time over to our guests and to have them talk a little bit about the history of Turkey. How are we supposed to understand this Turkish-European moment that is happening right here? What's the context of it, and where might we be going? Let's go ahead and start with Dr. Christine Isom-Verhaaren.
All right, so I'm very pleased to be here to talk about Turkey in the context of European studies. And this brings up for me the whole issue of continents, which as a geographical concept I find pretty problematic, and also historically, politically, and ethnically, and culturally problematic as well. And because I focus on an empire that covers 3 continents, it's always a question to me how relevant it is to actually look at things from a continent perspective. And especially because a city where I spent a lot of time is divided between two continents. So I brought my visual aids today, and I wear my visual aids. It's my favorite thing to do. So first of all, I have on a gray t-shirt that has a Turkish warrior on it. Any of you tell what he's actually doing? It's tricky. He's actually taking a selfie. So, and then I have my scarf that has various monuments in Istanbul on it. And finally, I have this hoodie that I bought last summer, and I love it because on this pocket it says Asia, and on this pocket it says Europe, and on the zipper it says Istanbul. And so now I brought Europe and Asia together. So, the Ottoman Empire from 1354 until 1923 included European lands. So basically for most of its history, European lands were part of the empire, and they were generally more important in a lot of ways than the lands in Asia, and were conquered earlier than parts of Anatolia. After 1517, the Ottoman Empire also included lands in Africa as well. So, studying the Ottoman Empire, I'm always looking at the fact that here is an empire that ruled territories in a variety of different areas. Also, as you learned, I have done a lot of concentration on Ottoman-French relations in the 16th century. So I've always been interested in how the Ottomans interacted with Europe. I guess in the sense of Western Europe in that point. So when I look at Turkey, which I have visited for a number of years, I find it, because of its history as being one of some 25 to 30 states as successor states of the Ottoman Empire, that it very much has its heritage of being part of Europe. And certainly the founder of the Turkish Republic, Ataturk, certainly was very much interested in westernizing the population of the country that was not already westernized. However, what we see today in Turkey, I think, is the fact that these westernization only went so deep in some areas. And so I have often found when I am in Turkey that it's a place that I consider to be schizophrenic, but I don't mean this in a really negative way. But Turkey is an area that's been a bridge between the Middle East and Europe for centuries. And so Turkey, in terms of its identity, is always trying to figure out, really, who are we as the Turks? So maybe I will stop there and we can proceed.
Jim, you want to jump on there?
Yeah. So I was just looking at Al Jazeera newspaper before I came over, and the timing of our conversation here is great because there's an European summit being held, European Union summit being held in the next few days. And the first paragraph says, tensions with Turkey will be high on the agenda of the European Union summit this weekend amid calls within the bloc to freeze relations. And it goes on to say that Chancellor Merkel has already called in an interview for not allowing Turkey to enter the European Union to freeze that, whereas France now is saying, no, we need to allow them in. So it's really causing a lot of consternation and divide within the European Union as well. I want to comment on, build on something that both of you said. One of them is this question of the kind of the split identity and trying to figure out who we are as a people in Turkey. And then Rob, you mentioned a sort of seminal event, a turning point in German political history in 1933. was a watershed kind of time. And I'd like to talk about an event that happened last July 2015 while we were living in Istanbul. Our home was up on a hill overlooking the Bosphorus and the first bridge, as it's sometimes called. We had already gone to sleep for the night, and it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, and we got a call from the branch president in Istanbul, Murat Çakır, who said, you need to go turn on the TV. We think there's a coup d'etat taking place here in Turkey. You know, and we could hear at that time jet airplanes flying low over the houses that we were at. So we went down and turned on CNN, who had good coverage, and saw that there were confrontations with tanks and soldiers and citizens on the bridge just down below our house. You could hear some shots being fired and some bombs. They showed that airplanes and helicopters from the Turkish army had been firing on the Parliament building, that there had been lots of casualties. President Erdogan had gone into hiding, and at a certain point, which was very dramatic, one of the TV broadcasters that hadn't been shut down by the coup planners held up an iPhone, and President Erdogan was speaking to the nation by iPhone, basically, FaceTime. And they were showing it on national TV, and he was basically saying a coup is underway and you need to get out in the streets and face it down. And so that was kind of a real dramatic, culminating example, and I would say a 1933 event in Germany that July 15th, 2016 is going to be remembered in exactly the same way. In fact, they renamed the bridge the July 15th Martyrs Bridge. There were over 250 people killed in the coup. Over 1,000 were injured. My thinking about these tensions and their impact on the European Union and on even relations with the United States, I think goes back to that question of what happened on that night. You have to remember that for 80 years, from the founding in 1923 of the Turkish Republic by Atatürk, following the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, for 80 years, Turkey had been a democratic republic, secular in nature, and the army was kind of the guardian of the secularism of the country. There was to be no religious influence in state affairs. And there had been several coups by the army, 3 to be exact, which sought to ensure that religion was not having too great a place in Turkish society. So there was already a tradition of this. But what happened was, starting in the late 90s, and in particular the early 2000s, when President Erdogan came to power, became prime minister, he and some others, including Mr. Gulen, that you hear a lot about, were allies, and they were trying to overcome this secular state and make Turkey more religious and have greater Islamization of the schools and politics and that sort of thing. So, but for that period of time between 2003 and 2016, he had been kind of a gradualist, kind of quietly trying to change things, to undo the sort of checks and balances, the separation of powers that democracy provides for and that the Turkish constitution provides for. But on the night of July 15th, things changed. He went from being a gradualist who was willing to be patient, and he became more absolutist and more authoritarian. He said this, and I remember vividly this quote in one of the articles I read the next day by a Turkish journalist. He said, "This act, as terrible as it is, as big a tragedy as it is, was a gift from God." He said, because now we'll know who our enemies are, and we can go out and get rid of them, basically. So the effort to make Turkey more Islamic picked up speed at that time, and he began to more overtly pursue the consolidation of power in the presidency. Within a day, he had declared a state of emergency. We weren't quite sure what that would mean, but that meant basically the suspension of laws. Tens of thousands of people were rounded up, suspected of helping the plotters. These included college professors, journalists, police officers, just a cross-section of society. And so this raised alarm bells in Europe and the United States because it was sort of a suspension of individual rights and freedoms overnight. And you didn't have to explain why you were arresting someone and hauling them off in the middle of the night. It was a state of emergency. And so basically a lot of people thought that Erdogan, some even accused him of having plotted the coup himself to promote his own political agenda. There were a lot of people who believed in that, and not just Turks either. But the evidence didn't really support it. And so basically you have now a chance for Erdogan to accomplish what he's been trying to do since he became prime minister. But he's feeling like he doesn't get a lot of support from Europe and the United States. When he asked the United States to extradite Gulen, who he believed was the mastermind, Gulen was his ally, but later on accused Erdogan's party of corruption and sent the police to round them all up, and they became enemies. And they asked for the extradition from the United States. The United States has to this day refused to extradite the man that many Turks, about half of society, view as the person who planned this plot to overthrow the government, the democratically elected government. So that has been a big sticking point in relations with the United States. With Europe, you mentioned the elections of last April, the referendum, that was designed to go from a parliamentary system to a presidential system, which would have put much more power, and it did because the election was won. But it was designed to give President Erdogan much more power so that he could nominate directly Supreme Court judges and generals and presidents of universities. He would have much, much greater power. And so this more authoritarian, autocratic approach to government. The referendum, like the election, parliamentary election 6 months earlier, was won, but by a margin of like 51 to 49%, with the secularists, called Kemalists, because Ataturk's first name was Kemal Ataturk. They form about half of society, and by 1% or so, the more conservative, Islamic-oriented segments of this population voted for Erdogan, voted for the referendum. They were infuriated, however, when they had planned some events in Europe, including in Germany, to go to the Turks living in diaspora to campaign for the referendum, vote yes. And at least 4 countries, including Germany, turned them down, wouldn't allow these Turkish politicians to come in the country and campaign among the Turkish immigrants. So they saw that as a slap in the face. Not many people expressed outrage about the coup. The United States was very late in even sending someone over to talk about it. So the Turks feel like there are a lot of reasons why they should be a member of the European Union. They first applied over 50 years ago. They've been waiting. There's been debate. It's been going very slow. At the same time, they feel like they have much to offer. A liberal Islamic country that has a strong economy, that can be an example to other Muslim countries. I mean, geographically and culturally, they bridge Europe and Asia. They're physically part of the country in Europe. They feel that they have earned a place. They're the largest army in NATO. They can help combat terrorism because they're a Muslim country, but fighting against ISIS and against other terror groups, along with European allies and the United States. So for security reasons, combating terrorism, and helping stem the tide of immigration, they feel like they've earned their place. And the fact that they haven't been allowed in, and it's looking like it won't happen, is, at least for half of the population, probably more, a huge insult.
It's very interesting. You've got it should not, it should sound very familiar. People talking the same language, but moving right past each other. A couple of things have really complicated this as well. I'm going to ask you a question
Okay.
about European values and Islamic values mixing in this world, and I want to bring it up though in the heightened context that it has. For example, a German Turkish citizen, a journalist by the name of Deniz Yücel, did I say that right? Yeah, Deniz Yücel. He was one of those who was captured as they were rounding up people, and was incarcerated. And Germany said he's a German citizen, and he was arrested for speaking against the regime and criticizing things like that, which was legal until about 10 minutes ago. And when are you going to reduce that and send him back? He's one of our citizens. We really are, and when we talk about a liberal thing, Europe feels like they've betrayed the European liberal tradition, the idea of free speech, the idea of a lot of these things. And with these, again, especially for the Germans, you've got these uncomfortable resonances with the loss of the free institutions that happened under the Nazis. And so we have this cultural problem added to by the fact that after the Syrian war and this huge influx of refugees in 2015, Turkey played a big role in that, in housing people, and they feel like Erdogan specifically used that because the Europeans needed him so desperately. He used that to become all-powerful, and felt like that he abused that goodwill that they had built up between each other. And so we have this war of words, and all of it is about values. They say, well, we can't possibly let these Turks in with the value. They don't have these liberal, open, democratic values of free speech and protection of minorities. Talking about what's happening with the Kurds and things like that. On the other hand, we say, why won't you let us in? We've done everything you've told us to do. And I want to talk then to Professor Isom-Verhaaren a little bit about how it comes to be that why are these values the fighting words in Turkey about Western values and Islamic values, specifically here?
From the Turkish point of view, I think they think the European Union is rather, what would I say, hypocritical. I mean, as to, there are plenty of abuses in Turkey of things that we would call human rights abuses. And I think that, well, most people would not deny that they are that. But when we look at some of the other countries that have been admitted to the European Union, not sure that their values are all that much different than the values in Turkey. So I think it's perhaps the hypocrisy that is one of the issues here. So when I have looked at why the European Union won't let in Turkey, I think the things they say are not really the real reasons. And I think the real reasons do have to do with the fact that Turkey is a predominantly Muslim country. And I think that is the big issue, even though Europe is kind of nominally Christian.
Okay, so you think it's the kind of right-wing factions, the movements like Pegida, which stands for patriotic Europeans against the Islamification of the West. It's movements like that that are really driving it. The question I was asking is to go back to historically with Ataturk and others. It seemed like he brought these Western values in and imposed them upon them, and that this kind of Islamicization was, or the Islamic values were always dormant here, and now Erdogan feels himself as as rectifying something that maybe was taken too far in the Ataturk range. Am I saying that too much?
Well, that might be Erdogan's opinion. I would say in Turkey today, that's why there are many people who, okay, so where I was staying in Istanbul, very close to where you were living in Bebek, and the people there were not interested in Islamic values whatsoever in this area of Istanbul. I saw people out jogging in attire that I would be surprised to see perhaps anywhere. I mean, so it's not everyone in Turkey who is in favor of these Islamic values. In terms of the referendum, it lost in the 3 largest cities. It lost in Istanbul, it lost in Ankara, it lost in Izmir. And so I think the country is really divided itself. I think there are many people who want it to be more Western, and that do not feel like the Western values were imposed upon them. But there are other people who do feel like they were imposed. For instance, at one point, it was against the law for women in Turkey to wear hijab in public institutions, sort of like in France.
Okay.
So secularism became, in a sense, the religion for some people.
So that is a large part of Turkey. This 49% you're talking about, where the 51% is pro-Islamic and wants some sort of change, basic change in Turkish society. And the question is that, in your opinion, does that fit into the European Union and the European Union's idea of what a state should be considering? You know, the anti-hijab, the Islamic, it's very pointed at the Islamic, but the idea that any sort of ritual vestment of anything that identifies yourself as religious should not be allowed in public. Starting in France, it's teetering in Germany. They're thinking about it. Just passed in Austria, just barely a month ago that they voted this in. You know, and that's something that's a little strange for us. Many people in this room wearing religious clothing as we speak, including me. And that sounds a little bit far away from our idea of an open society that has different possibilities for religious expression. But how is the German and European, French version of secularism maybe different from what we think in terms of separation of church and state?
Well, that is quite a bit different. But I honestly, Rob, don't think that it's primarily about Islamic values. I think it's more about politics and about human rights that the European Union and the Germans, primarily the French, the Italians, are concerned about. I mean, there are some sort of far-right sort of nativist, nationalist groups who just don't want any other, religions. That question of identity politics is strong in some areas for some groups. But the thing that I think that is concerning the European Union countries now, especially since July 15th of last year, is the violation, the suspension of human rights and the rule of law. Turkey's been a member since 1950 of the Council of Europe, which is always a prerequisite to becoming part of the European Union. And so they've signed on to those values that other European countries hold dear to. And a lot of Turks would argue that we've been very good at that, at least as good as some other European countries. But since July 15th, with the state of emergency, which Erdogan and the 50% say we had to do to preserve our country, it was a state of emergency. Our parliament was fired upon. The president was going to be assassinated. They sent teams to assassinate him. From their point of view, this was a dire emergency which hardly anyone recognized, and that they did this in order to make sure that enemies of the state were not going to continue their dastardly deeds. But of course that's what Europe is reacting to now. I think that as time goes on and sort of cooler heads prevail, I think that I'm hoping and thinking, and I really believe that Turkey will turn back to the West, because they've made overtures to Russia, to Iran, to other less savory kinds of regimes, let's say. But I think that they will want to still be associated with Europe, and that the state of emergency will be lifted, the rule of law will prevail. So I don't think it's so much about Islamic things. I mean, Europe has been pretty good in a lot of ways about absorbing other cultures, other migrant groups, etc. historically.
Until it goes in waves, and this year is a big wave for the populist right. Luckily in France it was averted. In Germany it was not. Merkel's barely, that she was able to hold on to things. They talk about the Merkel-Dämmerung, the twilight of Angela. Also yesterday in Austria, the right-wing populists also swept the government.
It's not just, we're talking about Putin, this style, this autocratic style of leadership. Trump's, some of the issues surrounding Trump and migration, immigrants, and that sort of thing. Maduro in Venezuela, Duterte, there are these strongman leaders coming to the fore that are responding to forces in society, not just in Europe, but in the United States and around the world, because people are afraid.
You talked about cooler heads prevailing. Where do we look for some cooler heads? Is Macron possibly?
I think he's possibly one. He's the one that's saying, look, we need to talk about this. We need to not freeze out Turkey. They are an important NATO ally. They're helping us fight terrorism. They're helping us reduce immigration into Europe, illegal immigration. I think there are some cooler heads. So I just think that the political process in time will yield a result that is more measured and more liberal, let's say.
I hope you're right. Christine, where do you see, what does Turkey have to change? What needs to happen in order for an entrance into the European Union, or has Brexit and the latest wave of right-wing populism made that impossible? What changes need to be made in order for Turkey to have this rapprochement that Tim's talking about?
Well, as I said, I've been going to Turkey for a long time, and Turkey, for me, is different now than it used to be. For me, it needs to go back to what it used to be like, which is, well, not a state of emergency, not someone like Erdogan running the country. And it's hard to know how easy that is to happen, given that, as we've just mentioned, this is not just limited to Turkey. We're seeing a worldwide phenomenon of these populist leaders who are very nationalistic,
anti-globalization,
and so I think a lot of things have to change in Turkey, but not just in Turkey. They have to change other places as well. So, but certainly we need to get rid of the state of emergency. We need to, there have been so many academics who have lost their positions for really very little evidence of any involvement in, anything to do with the plot. Journalists, as you said, judges, that has to change, right? These people have to be able to have a right to express their opinions without it resulting in losing your position or being sent to jail.
But what do you see in places like Austria, Germany, Rob? You've been there a lot this summer and you follow it closely. German politics is in a state of flux. On the one hand, Chancellor Merkel was one of the ones that allowed a lot of immigrants into Germany, opened the doors basically, and then had to back that down and almost lost the election because of that. And then now she's saying, no, we need to freeze Turkey out. We can't have them doing this. But politics comes. What's your assessment? Same question basically, but about Germany.
It's a really, really interesting question. Angela Merkel saw herself as being motivated by Western values and said, look, we cannot turn people back who need, and wanted to be kind of a light in this Western, and of course had to give into reality at some point and has weathered the storm barely of this kind of right-wing populism coming back. And on the other hand, we have the question of integration, which I think is one of the greatest questions of our time. Will it be integrated? Will it not be integrated? And so I wanted to kind of, as we're opening it up now first to you and then to everybody else here, let's think about doner kebabs for a minute, right? Doner kebabs.
Your mind on water
kebabs. It's invented, of course, in Berlin, Schöneberg, at Hassan. it existed as a plate food, but the street food as we know it today, the doner kebab, was invented by the diaspora. Bushido and some of these other Turkish rappers, huge, but in Germany, and they have a big following, of course, in Turkey, and there's some that are a little bit more, Bushido is kind of out there. They have some that are a little bit more aligned with traditional values and with Turkish culture, and everyone from Bushido, and I hate to say it, Lady Bitch Ray, a big Turkish rapper in Germany. What is going to happen? What about the European version of Turkey? Germany's, which in a lot of ways, they say that, they joke that Berlin is the second largest Turkish city because of the expatriate population and things like that. Where does that go? What role is that diaspora position going to play? These Turks who are somehow being decried as never having really truly integrated, but are creating this hip hop culture. Even white kids in Berlin, in some neighborhoods, will rock around saying "Ich nicht verstehe." It's like, I don't understand, with the Turkish accent because it's cool. It's got street cred. Like, Turkish is cool now. It's there. It's going to stay. You can't think of the German cityscape without thinking of these multicultural, vibrant, beautiful, fantastic neighborhoods and films and things. What role is this integration going to have in this clash between the big heads that are prevailing? What's going to happen?
I wonder if anyone in the audience would like to respond to that. Is that okay?
Should we open it up? Do either of you have anything?
In Turkey, and maybe there are some thoughts about that.
Let's go ahead, if you want to, step up right here. Heather, you want to give them
Yes.
the spiel?
Okay, yes. Because we have people who are joining us, watching this being recorded, podcast, whatever, you need to come over to the mic here on near the map, and we would just ask that you give us your name and you also tell us your major and pose your question.
You can go ahead and make a line if you want to make sure that you get up there and get heard. But we'll accept first come, first serves here.
Okay, I'm Jacob. I am a German teaching major and a European studies minor. Just to talk about integration, I'm not like an expert or anything on immigration as a whole in Germany, but I did a study abroad in Tübingen this last summer, and we had to do a project, and my group chose integration and how it functions in Tübingen. And we kind of compared this to Germany as a whole, just because there's like similar patterns of immigration in Germany as a whole, although it does vary from city to city. Basically, as the immigrants and refugees, so I'll just kind of put them into the same group. Not that they're the same, status, but lots of immigrants and refugees are coming to Germany at the same time. A lot of Germans had this naive hope that integration was going to happen immediately, that they were going to learn the German language, that they were going to be integrated into society, but that's not reality. And it really frustrated the Germans because, here's this crisis that never happened to them. At least, on such a large scale since after World War II. Like, this was the biggest influx since after World War II, not just of immigrants, but of refugees who are coming to seek asylum. And of course, Merkel, as was mentioned, she responded as to what she thought was right. She opened the borders and let, so many people in, but then there was the question, how are we going to integrate them? So, as the Germans became more frustrated, they became more unwilling, maybe that's the wrong word, but it is a word I'll use, to help, because they didn't know what to do. They thought it was going to happen quickly, but then it's like, okay, where are the resources? Who's going to help? We talked to many people behind the scenes, and it's insane. Like, you have to find doctors for women. You have, that will meet their religious needs, but also their hygienic needs who are pregnant. You have to find them doctors who are able to come into these refugee homes to help them. You have to have language courses, but where are the language courses for the mothers of children who can't bring their children to the language courses? So a lot of the people don't learn the German language. That means they don't integrate, which means that they can't get jobs, which means they can't, have good education. The German school system, the way it's set up, also kind of combats that, and a lot of immigrants you know, second, third generation also can't get good education and good jobs because of the way the school system is set up. And it's a lot of politics, it's a lot of just, you know, things you would never think about, like school systems, like who would think about that even for second and third generation, but these, you know, they speak German, but, you know, their parents weren't integrated, so they're almost seen as second-class citizens at some points, even though they are German, they speak German just as well as, you know, people who are traditionally German, use German roots. So integration, it's a really tricky topic. Tübingen was actually, it's really successful in the way it integrates. It creates apartments for refugees and families where like 70–80% is refugees or immigrants, and then 20% is like, what do you say, normal German citizens, so that they have people to talk to, they can learn German, they can integrate more into society, and it's a very open and international city. On the other hand, there are other regions where it's failing, it's not working, the political system is backed up, the social system can't handle all the paperwork. I mean, people are stuck in refugee homes, I'm just used to saying the German word, refugee homes for years on end, when it's supposed to take around 6 months to a year to process the paperwork. So yeah, that's long story short.
Professor Toronto has a
Well,
a comment.
historically, I mean, going back, you know, you could go back a long ways, but just to say in the last couple of hundred years, even in our own country here, we've had waves of immigrants as well. And, you know, there's always a period when new groups arrive, when they're kicked around, when there's questions about who they are, where do their loyalties lie, are they corrupt, you know, do they bring in disease and criminal elements, and there's always this adjustment period.
Hombres.
Yeah, exactly. But one thing that you find is over time, as the immigrants, you know, begin to take jobs, and oftentimes they're the lower rungs of the economy, but jobs that a lot of the locals don't want to have. Lots of economic studies in different countries have shown that on balance, immigrants are a plus to the economies that they come into. But what happens is, as they start to serve in the military of the country they come into, as they start to become the stars of the local soccer teams, you know, and movie stars and rappers and all of these things, that integration process starts to take hold. And we see it in the United States. I mean, Latter-day Saints have their own problems with integration as a ethnic and religious group. You know, the Jews, the Chinese, the Italians, you know, and this is, we're just seeing the latest iteration, the latest manifestation of this in Germany. But I really believe that you know, over time, you know, these things that you were talking about, Rob, the cultural things, do have a powerful impact in helping dispel myths and stereotypes in culture.
My idea that belongs to a European culture. Doner kebabs are Europe. I mean, it's invented in Europe. In Europe, this multicultural is a part of it. It's not going back in the box.
We'll have to have a debate some other time about where doner kebabs were invented.
Yeah, I'm sure they were invented in
The
Europe.
Turks hate that. Well, talk to German Turks.
The Arabs also claim it as well. They have a different name for it. It's called shawak.
Right.
But anyway, the whole food debates that are out there are always interesting. And I just think that the trust-building measures, like President Erdogan, going back to what Christine said, at some point, they're going to lift the state of emergency. They're going to let people out of jail. I mean, they're going to return to a state of normalcy where the constitution of their own country is respected. I think that's going to happen, but there have to be face-saving and trust-building measures. One of them being that agreement that was signed in March of last year, 2016, where the European Union said, we will give you $6 billion, and we'll talk about allowing Turks to have visas so that they can travel in Europe. In exchange, for every European or immigrant that we send to Turkey and you accept them, you can send one that's been legally processed, you can send them to Europe. When they started doing that, the number of illegal immigrants dropped dramatically. But one of the things that really rankles Erdogan and the Turks in general is they received hardly any of that money to help take care of them, so Turkey is bearing a huge brunt of 3.5 million refugees in the country, the most in any country on the earth. And they still haven't heard anything about visas. So the European Union could do their side and say, okay, we'll pay the bills, we'll do what we promised, and you know, let the people out and start practicing liberal democracy again, even if it has an Islamic slant to it, things can happen. And in the meantime, culture and that sort of thing are making the process of integration more feasible.
Step up, Paul.
Well, I was just going to say, in 2010, Istanbul was the European capital of culture. And so if we kind of go back, a few years to these times when the relations were a lot better, I think there could be progress made. There's something to build on. The doner kebab, a perfect example, right?
Yeah, I just had a question. My name is Wesley White. I'm a European Studies major. I had a question as relates to NATO. Do you see any type of groundswell in other European nations for possibly expelling Turkey from NATO? I think the most recent example of somebody being kicked out of a multinational organization would be Russia and Putin getting kicked out of the G8, and I understand that they're to have different goals, but do you see a scenario in which the rest of NATO could say, look, this is not the same Turkey politically that joined NATO, and you do not have the same values any longer? Thanks.
I'm not sure that NATO is based on those kinds of values. I think that they see a very strong military ally who's done a lot in the Middle East to help stamp out ISIS. And one of the big problems right now is that when the European Union accuses Turkey of human rights abuses, Turkey often says, well, look, you're supporting terrorist groups here in the Middle East by supporting the YPG, the Kurdish militant groups that are trying to overthrow Turkey and have killed thousands of Turkish citizens. We're paying them, arming them. So I think that Turkey is going to be a strong member of NATO for a long time to come. That's my view.
And given Turkey's geographic position, the thing I worry about when I see the problems with Turkish-U.S. relations is the United States needs Turkey. Its location is actually very crucial in terms of our role in the Middle East. So I can't imagine NATO kicking Turkey out.
The other side of Turkey, you've got Europe on one side, the other side is Iraq.
Yeah.
And so if
Iran.
And Iran.
And the Soviet Union.
With Iran.
Yeah, so, yeah.
And Syria.
And Syria.
Yeah.
Some of these have had one or two things happening, right? Good, thank you.
Hi, my name is Kelsey, and I am a double major in Russian and anthropology, and I'm minoring in European studies. And I just had a question. At the beginning of the discussion, we were talking about Western/European values versus Islamic values. I know that those are technically just bubble blanket umbrella terms that are very generalized, but what, in your opinion, are the main major differences between Western values and Islamic values? Because I know at the end of the day, there's just a lot of families that are trying to feed their kids, provide for themselves, have a job. I feel like we're more similar in our values. I think maybe there's cultural expectations and diversity in how we go about obtaining those values, but for you, what would you say would be the biggest differences between Western and Islamic values?
Just answer that with a little anecdote about my Uncle Berti. He just passed away this last year. My great uncle Albert Segla, living in Munich. And he would go on, the Turks that are, and I knew there was a Turkish family that lived upstairs from him who brought him food nearly every day, who walked with him, and they would sit out on the boat bench, they'd play chess. I said, well, Grandpa, or Berti, what about the people upstairs? And he says, no, these nandas, they're very different. Those are my Turks. And they're different. I'm talking about the Turks. And I was like, you're going to have to help me out here. And I think that is at the core there. Because really when it came to his Turks were not any different than he was. His Turks went shopping at the same places. Their kids were well behaved and pleasant. It was the other Turks, the imaginary Turks, the faceless Turks that he was worried about. Those Turks, they're great. They're great, and those are the Turks, of course. And so that's the anecdote I would give to kind of talk about what real Islamic and Western values are.
Right.
And I'll give you another anecdote. So where I used to teach at Benedictine University in the Chicago area, we had a very large Muslim student body. And so we had an event, and I attended it, and I was talking to some Muslim women who were there, students at the university. And I said I was Mormon. They said, "Oh, I love Mormons. My best friend in high school was a Mormon. We have the same values. You know, we believe in modesty. We believe in, you know, you have a dietary code." You know, and then she just went on and on about how much she loved her Mormon friends.
Let me share an anecdote just to even things out too. So, you know, Islam has been here in America since the time that the slaves started coming over from Africa. And Islam has been in Europe for a very, very long time as well. And if you talk to Muslims who have lived, you know, for generations in America and in Europe and other parts of the world as well, they'll say, you know, this bifurcation of Western versus Islamic is false. It's and really what one friend said to me. Here's the anecdote. When asked this question about what's it like to be a Muslim in America, says, the Constitution of the United States allows me to be a true Muslim in a way that I can't in any other country, because Islam believes in human rights and democracy and respect for the rights of other people and for religious freedom. So now, you always have to think of Islam as a spectrum, right? Depending on who you contact on that spectrum, you may get different opinions. But for Muslims who live in the United States and Europe, most of them are really feel blessed to live in this environment, and that there is no contradiction between Islam and liberal democratic values.
Thank you for your questions. Good question. Two more questions. We'll limit it at these, and then we'll go out and Heather, do you want to say something about what's going to happen afterwards
Sure.
before we answer this question?
Sure. Do I have the mic on up here?
Yeah.
Okay. So we will adjourn, and we'll enjoy maybe a similarly contested food, baklava in terms of its origin, but not kebabs, and invite you to continue the conversation after we finish up with these two questions.
My name is Micah Russell. I'm a MESA major, international strategy and diplomacy minor. Dr. Toronto, you mentioned the Kurdish problem in Turkey. I'd kind of like to spin it back to that. We understand that a lot of Turkey's political energy, I guess, goes towards suppressing the Kurdish nationalism. This is kind of hypothetical, but if Turkey was allowed into the European Union, would we see an uprising of Kurdish nationalism calling for the European Union to help end the human rights issues that they're suffering from in Turkey, or would it be seen as a benefit or a detriment to the Kurdish people in Turkey?
If they were admitted to the European Union?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you would hope that, I think the Kurds would expect and hope that that would in fact allow them greater opportunities and less repression. But from the point of view of the Turkish government, and to get the roots of this, we need to have Christine talk about the way that Britain and France carved up the Middle East after World War I and disregarded completely where peoples lived. So the Kurdish people in the Ottoman Empire all lived kind of together, but when the British and French drew the lines to promote their own interests, the Kurds ended up in Turkey and Iran and Iraq and Syria, a people who have an identity and aspirations for statehood just like any other peculiar people, let's say. So now the greatest concentration are in Turkey itself. And we've just been reading recently in the newspaper about the Kurds who have fought so well against ISIS and helping the Allies defeat ISIS. Now, it's kind of a payoff. I think they want to have their own state. They've always dreamed of it, right? And so that's why they're fighting against, it could break out against the Iraqi government. series of basket case, but I think it's going to go on in Turkey for a long time. Because you have Kurdish nationalists who won't stop short until they have their own state. They won't give up. And so if they get into the European Union, there'll probably be calls to allow the Kurds to break away from Turkey. But that's like taking a third of the country, right? It's, you know, we fought a war in the United States over the concept of a union, right? And you can't just break off because you identify with different economic...
They'll be joining that recently had Scotland in it.
Yeah, exactly.
Catalonia and
right,
all of these
exactly.
places.
All of these nationalist movements now. So the Kurds aren't going to give up, at least a segment of the Kurdish population. And the Turks aren't going to allow them to break away.
But you don't think the European Union would try to interfere in any way with it?
I don't think that you can force a country to allow part of the country to secede.
And the problem is, it's not like we have areas that are purely Kurdish. I mean, it's a very mixed population. And a lot of areas that the Kurds claim were formerly claimed by the Armenians. So, you know, it's very difficult to decide, you know, and that was one of the problems at the end of World War I. It was very naive to think, oh, we can just carve up the world for these nationalities and not have competing claims for the same territories.
Yeah. I think that Rob mentioned the precedent, just recent precedent of Catalonia that's happening, that they want to secede from Spain and have their own. You watch that, they're part of the European Union, so that might be a way to judge what might happen if Turkey gets in and the Kurds want to break away. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Last question.
I'll try to keep it short. My name is Jonah, and I'm a freshman open major. And I was just wondering, it's obvious to me that that the passport or that the visa block was part of an underlying problem that's not just that simple. But I was wondering if you had any opinions on whether that's going to be an escalating thing that's long-lasting. Do you think that the U.S. will extradite Gulen and the visa block will end? Or, I mean, the lira already dropped 4%, was it, after Turkey blocked U.S. citizens. Do you think that Turkey will have to kind of give up to that measure, or?
First of all, after a question like that, come talk to us about adding a European Studies major. And then it's open up.
You answer that one.
Can you repeat just the essence of the question?
So basically I'm asking, do you think that Turkey will be able to hold out with blocking the visas of US? I mean, I know it doesn't really affect the US as much, but do you think that Turkey will be able to stand economically if they continue that?
That's a tempest in a teapot. It's going to pass. It was a tit-for-tat thing.
Right.
The United States has ever since Erdogan came to power just looked the other way, thinking that, you know, that this isn't going to come to anything, the sort of increasing Islamization and the power grab and all of that. But I think they wanted to send a shot across the bow that we're not going to put up with things anymore. The Turkish government had arrested a couple of Turkish nationals who worked in the American consulate.
Right.
And they had also previously arrested some dual citizen Turkish Americans. And I think they just wanted to say, look, you can't do this anymore. And so we're not going to give visas for Turks to go to the United States who apply here in Turkey. And so the Turks came back but one-upped them by saying, we're not going to allow you to get visas to come to Turkey wherever you apply in the world, okay? And so it's going to calm down and they'll work it out. You know, despite the fact that we won't extradite Gulen, and I don't think we ever will,
Right.
because there's not any really solid evidence. We believe in the rule of law in our country, and so it's pretty hard to make a case for extradition. Despite that, you know, I don't think that our relationship with Turkey has been seriously damaged.
So just as far as like time goes, do you think it's gonna, I mean, like this summer, do you think we'll see an end to that, or do you think that, I mean, I know there's really no way to say for sure, but
I'd be surprised if it goes.
He wants to go to Turkey.
Yeah, he's trying to do that. Right.
my vacation is planned.
Well, it's a question. I'm on some email lists with people who are in charge of security and visas in Turkey, and that's the big debate: is how long will this go on? Because there's all kinds of things that need visas for, including our volunteers in Turkey. We don't know if the ones from the MTC are going to be able to get there or not, but I'll be surprised if it goes on for more than 2 or 3 more months.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you all for spending your time with us this afternoon, being such a great audience with such good participation. And let's thank our 2 guests who come to us and talk to us today.